The history of the first 500 years of the church is really a history of ideas. This, I'm afraid, doesn't make it very easy history to get your head around. We know much more about the ideas than the people behind them, and the ideas often seem complex and pedantic. Yet at the same time, the key formulae of belief that we state today in our creeds and liturgies were born out of these complicated arguments. Had arguments gone a slightly different way, our faith now would be different and poorer. So in this session, we're going to have a very brief introduction to Greek philosophy. Why? Because Greek philosophy dominated the early church as much as globalization and market economics dominate our society today. You lived and breathed it, and once St. Paul made the bold decision to preach the gospel to the Gentiles, the Christian faith became forever linked with Greek thought. If you ever doubt that, then just read the first verse of John's Gospel. The word logos, which we translate as word, is a very Greek concept. For the purposes of their impact on the Christian faith, the two really big Greek thinkers are Plato and Aristotle. Many people would say that Plato was the greatest thinker who ever thought, and his influence is incalculable. He was the pupil of Socrates and lived 400 years before Jesus, about the time of the last Old Testament prophets. He thought about everything, but for our purposes, one of his key ideas is that this world is just a shadow of the real, eternal world. He told a famous story of some people imprisoned in a cave since childhood, and they could only see the very back of the cave. On the back of the cave, they see shadows of people cast by firelight. They believe that these shadows are real. One day, one of them escapes and sees the real world. He returns to tell his fellow prisoners the good news, but they would rather kill him than accept his version of the truth. They want to live in the shadowland. For Plato, we spend our lives looking at the shadow things, but the reality of things are in eternity. If you know the book of Hebrews, you might recognize some of this language. If you've ever thought of your body as a poor, weak thing and your soul as something immortal that when you die will spring out of your body and go to heaven, you're thinking platonically. Aristotle was Plato's pupil and tutor to Alexander the Great. He also wrote a lot about everything, but for Christians, it is his ethical writing that is most important. He believed in what we call virtue, and when you study ethics, you might come across virtue ethics. That is an Aristotelian way of thinking about how we are good. Aristotle used Greek forms of reasoning to discover what true happiness and goodness consisted of, which ultimately, he concludes, is contemplation of eternity and the divine. Why is all this important? It's important because Plato and Aristotle, along with others, were heavyweight thinkers, and the Greeks took pride in their intellectual abilities. In Paul's letter to the Corinthians, chapter 1, verse 22, "For Jews demand signs and Greeks desire wisdom, but we proclaim Christ crucified a stumbling block to Jews and foolishness to Gentiles. But to those who are the called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ the power of God and the wisdom of God." If Christianity was going to make any headway outside of Jewish culture, it had to find a way of engaging with the culture around it, which is exactly what we see Paul doing when he preaches in the Athenian marketplace. It's also important because the converts and theologians in the generation after the apostles were Greeks. They had been steeped in this kind of thought. When they became Christians, they immediately saw points of connection between their new faith and their inherited philosophy. A prime example of this is the early theologian Justin Martyr. Justin was born in Palestine around the year 100. He grew up as a pagan, became a Platonist philosopher, and moved to Rome. Apparently, whilst on the beach one day, he met a mysterious old man who encouraged him to read the Old Testament, and as a result he converted to Christianity. However, he remained a philosopher, wore a philosopher's cloak, and believed that Christianity was another school of philosophy, albeit the true one. Justin realised that Christianity was held in low esteem by the Romans, and that many false accusations were being made against it. Justin defended Christianity in a work addressed to the emperor called his First Apology. He pointed out that there were many parallels between Christian and pagan thought and between the New Testament and Plato. He placed a high value on human reason, arguing that Jesus, the Logos, was the embodiment of divine reason. Because Greek philosophers used reason, they were actually speaking the words of God without realizing it. Justin's approach was taken up by other Christian writers, now known as the apologists, the defenders of the faith. The greatest of these was probably Origen, who was the first systematic theologian of the Church. Origen came from Alexandria, the great Egyptian port on the Mediterranean. His father was executed for his Christian faith, and Origen supported his family by teaching. In his early 20s, he radically renounced his philosophical teaching, deciding to take Jesus' Sermon on the Mount as literally as possible, possibly including self-castration, and devoted himself to Christian teaching. He had a huge secretarial team, and as a result wrote thousands of books, including some of the first Bible commentaries. Because of his vast intelligence, he was quick into the fray when it came to disputing with Greek philosophers. Origen was a dyed-in-the-wool Platonist who believed in a separation of the spiritual and the physical world, and that humans have both physical and spiritual bodies. Human souls were originally perfect, but somehow fell away from God, and so God created the world for these fallen souls to dwell in. The world, therefore, is not God's perfect creation that has fallen, but a place where fallen souls struggle to become closer to God. He seems to have taught, and it's quite difficult to know because most of Origen's writings were later destroyed, but he seems to have taught that all souls, even the devil himself, will eventually perfect themselves and so reach God. For this and other views, Origen was condemned after his death, and sadly he is more often known as an eccentric heretic when he was one of the first and greatest of the biblical scholars. Not every theologian was happy with this direction of travel. The philosophical speculation of thinkers like Origen were felt to lead to heresy and far away from the truth of Scripture. The theologian Tertullian from North Africa was among the first to put together a canon of church teaching in Scripture, and he famously declared, "What has Athens to do with Jerusalem? What concord is there between the academy and the church?" Quoting Paul's letter to the Colossians, he argued against an overly philosophical approach to the Christian faith. Does any of this have any relevance to our church today? You don't hear Plato quoted very much, even if I think many people have Platonic beliefs at their heart. You're certainly not going to hear Origen quoted in a sermon. But I think there is a point of relevance, and it's worth thinking about this. What cultural influences are bearing down on today's church? What is the philosophical sea in which we swim? What about the language of business ethics and leadership styles? What about psychology and psychometric testing? You could say, what has Harvard to do with Jerusalem? What concord is there between the psychologist's couch and the church? In every generation, the church faces a difficult balance between working with the world's language, learning from the world's concepts, and incorporating those concepts in a helpful way into our Christian faith, while still keeping a distinctly Christian worldview.